Welcome to the Career Change Podcast, where you'll discover the frank and practical advice and resources that are already proven to work in the real world when it comes to changing careers or figuring out what business is right for you when you are a smart but likely also stuck, overwhelmed, or overthinking person in your mid-30s, your 40s, your mid-50s. I'm your host, Rikke Hansen, a career change advisor, entrepreneur, and former corporate HR professional with over 15 years experience of helping thousands of people just like you identify or create careers or businesses that are both meaningful and future-proof. Welcome home. Hey, it's Rikke here, and welcome to episode 5, where we will talk about why your perfectionism might very well be the very thing that's sabotaging your career transition efforts right now, and how it might very well be a buffer that you are inserting between you and your dreams. And of course, most importantly, what to do about that, how to change that. Now, perfectionism is a massive subject, and I would love to cram everything I know into one episode for you because it's such an important topic to talk about. But since I'm all about you taking action at the end of the day, what I want to do in this particular episode is to focus on one specific aspect of perfectionism. And then there'll be plenty more coming down the line. But today, it's really about how perfectionism and fear of failure, they literally go together like peanut butter and jam. Or in my case, cheese and jam. I don't know what you put on top of your cheese. I put jam. That's a very Scandinavian thing to do. My husband, who's from South America, is like, oh, what are you doing? Anyway, if you are a smart person who has a history of being very self-critical, or very hard on yourself, or of setting impossibly high standards, and whose identity is very tied up with your professional performance, and you are stuck in your career change or with starting your own business right now, then this episode is for you. Now, one of the first things I'll do when I have new clients working with me privately, in addition to giving them a framework for how to approach the transition step by step, is that I'll talk to them about what I call the emotional weather forecast, i.e., what to expect that might happen when you start changing careers or start a new business. And that's the fact that it won't be all unicorns and rainbows, no matter what people over on Instagram might tell you in terms of, ooh, just follow your passion, or ooh, just go for it, and ooh, just do what feels easy. None of that BS. In the real world, what happens often when you want to change careers or start a business is suddenly all kinds of emotional sabotage stuff comes up, right? I often joke with my clients that one of the fastest way to get to know yourself, for better or for worse, is to start a business or change careers. It's literally like personal discovery on speed. So if you are feeling all kinds of things coming up for you, that's what's happening. There's nothing wrong with you. That is just part of the process that a lot of people don't really want to talk about. But you know what? You're amazing as you are. We just need to talk about it and talk about how to deal with it. All right? So if you're someone who scores highly on the perfectionism scale, then one thing that will very likely impact you and come up very early on in the transition process is that your perfectionism will be rearing its ugly head and do whatever it can to protect you from failure. You might even be experiencing that right now. And if you are, then you are in the right place. Not only do I have 15 years experience of helping perfectionists change careers, start a new business, but it's also something that I'm personally intimately familiar with. I've got you, my friend. But first of all, let's talk about what kind of perfectionism we're actually talking about, as well as why it can very negatively impact your transition if you're not careful, what it's costing you. We'll talk about the dark side of perfectionism because it's so important to talk about. And even more importantly, we'll talk about what to do about it, how to decide what's more important to you than being perfect. Right? Because once you're aware of what's going on and what's really happening, once we shine a light on those dark areas, then going forward, you can catch yourself when you're doing it. You can understand what's going on and you can be more compassionate with yourself and you can choose differently again and again and again. It is so important to address how your perfectionism might be sabotaging your efforts right now, because if you want to start your own business or you want to change career, you are going to have to learn how to deal with your perfectionism and choose differently. And the more complex the world gets, the more important it is not to impose perfectionism on yourself, because it's not a very future-proof skill, right? So let's talk about perfectionism, and more specifically, maladaptive perfectionism, i.e. toxic perfectionism. So generally in psychology, when you talk about perfectionism, people often refer to this scale called the multidimensional perfectionism scale by Hewitt and Flett. And it's a scale like that you score yourself, and it measures 3 different dimensions of perfectionism. One of them is self-oriented perfectionism. That's the self-imposed, excessively high personal standards variety. There's also socially prescribed perfectionism. That's more the excessively high social expectations. And then there's other-oriented perfectionism, which is when you have excessively high expectations of others. Now, what I've found over the years, at least with the clients that I've worked with, is a lot of them tend to have what is the self-oriented type of perfectionism, i.e. it is what they're doing to themselves. There's also a subset that has the socially prescribed, by their culture, but we'll talk about that in a different time. Today, I really want to talk about the self-oriented type of perfectionism. When you require it from yourself, you very much measure your self-worth in terms of perfection. You're self-critical. You don't have very good you don't have a very good way of rewarding yourself when you do something well or congratulating yourself. And it's very much a way of thinking about yourself, a toxic way of thinking about yourself, where your sense of self is so tied up with how well you perform at work. Okay, like just for the fun of it. To get the hypochondriac up in you, let me read aloud some of the questions that you will be asked in this kind of scale. Don't worry about doing it, but just for the fun of it, see if you can relate to this. I brood over mistakes that I've made in front of others. I don't want people to see me do something unless I'm very good at it. I should solve my own problems rather than admit them to others. Or I must appear to be in control of my actions at all times. Or I try to keep my faults to myself. Or I need to be seen as perfectly capable in everything I do. Or this one is my favorite. It is very important to me that I always appear on top of things. If you can relate to any of those, yes, you're very likely also one of those self-oriented perfectionists. Now, one of the other very important ways to know if you fall into this category, because this is really how it'll negatively impact you when you go through a transition process, is where it gets really toxic, is how you talk to yourself and how you think of yourself when you don't live up to your own standards or when you fail. A toxic perfectionist will literally go, all right, I am a failure, or I am not good enough. As in, you are the problem, you're the failure, you're really the issue. Whereas someone who's got a healthy sense of self and don't have that kind of toxic perfectionism, be like, okay, that was a failure, but I am still a good person. I.e., in short, if you have the toxic kind of perfectionism, you probably don't tend to be very nice to yourself or talk very nicely to yourself. And you'll probably also tend to take things very personally. Have you ever had anybody saying that to you? Oh my God, you're a little bit sensitive, or you take things personally. I'm raising my hand here. So perfectionism, like we are talking about here, is a way of thinking about yourself, of being very critical, self-critical, and having impossibly high standards, right? Let me ask you something. How is that perfectionism working for you? Right? If you're listening to this podcast, then I would like you to be very open-minded as to how we might want to change this and what might be more important to you than being perfect. So let's move into talking about how this way of viewing yourself and the world, how that impact what happens when you decide that you want to do something new in your work life, whether that's a new job or new career or new business. Now, I almost call this episode Why Perfectionists Rarely Change Careers or Start Their Own Business. Because here's the deal. Perfectionists makes things so much harder for themselves. Have you noticed? Like, one thing we all have in common is we don't really tend to look for the easiest way to do things, do we? We like to make things hard for ourselves. So let me ask you a really important question. What do most perfectionists tend to have in common? What are they most afraid of? What are you most afraid of? The big F, right? Failure, of failing. Fear of failure. And what do you do when you're afraid of failing? You do everything possible to avoid failure. You do everything possible to not engage in activities or take actions that could bring failure, i.e., maladaptive, toxic perfectionism is a lot about what you choose not to do in order to protect yourself from failure. But let's talk about why that is a problem. Actually, it's a showstopper when you want to transition into something new in your career. It's a showstopper because if you want to reinvent or change careers or start a business, then you are going to have to do things you've never done before, or use skills you never used before. Take actions or do things that will make you feel uncomfortable and that are literally impossible to get right or perfect straight away. And that might even, gasp, result in what you perceive as failure. Bam! Does that ring a bell? Might that explain why you're stuck? Why you're not doing those things you really ought to be doing? Yeah, because the very things you need to do and expose yourself to in order to change might result in failure. You literally view them as opportunities for failure to beat yourself up with. And hence, you're afraid of going there, right? Am I inside your head right now, by the way? I hope so. I really want you to feel understood, to know that you're not alone. There's some really interesting studies done by Professor Andrew P. Hill. He's a professor here in the UK at York St. John University. He's done some really incredibly interesting studies around perfectionism. In one of the experiments, he gave both a group of perfectionists and a group of non-perfectionists specific goals. But what he didn't tell them was that the test was rigged, i.e., none of them would succeed. So both groups, they sort of kept putting in the same amount of effort, but one group enjoyed the whole thing a lot less. And here's the catch, they gave up earlier. Now, which group do you think gave up earlier? The perfectionists or the non-perfectionists? The perfectionists, of course. Now, here's a quote from Professor Hill. Perfectionists tend to respond more harshly in terms of emotions. They experience more guilt and more shame, and they give up more easily. They have quite avoidant coping tendencies when things can't be perfect. Have you found yourself avoiding or giving up on doing things you weren't good at quickly, or that will make you have to do imperfect things in public? I.e., with your career change, with starting a business, you might have had a stab or a couple of stabs, but it never really turned into a habit or a consistent thing or a practice. Yeah, perfectionists will do everything they can to avoid shame, right? Guilt, rather give up than not being perfect. When I read that study, I was like, wow, I can think back to so many examples of this in my own life, in my clients' life, in terms of, things got hard, it wasn't that easy, and there were loads of opportunities for them to fail, so they'd rather not engage. Now, one of the interesting things about Hill and some of the studies he's done a lot of studies with high performers, especially within sports, which is very related to being a high performer in business and work. And the single biggest predictor of success in sports is practice. Practice. You keep at it. You keep doing it. Let's talk about your career change, starting a business. Have you made it a practice to do those things that you need to do in order to make a transition? Or did you actually stop or didn't even try because you didn't feel very good at them? Maybe you have this idea, I see this with so many people. I see a lot of smart people, they have this idea that your perfect career, your dream career, your passion of running a business, that should come to you naturally and immediately, and you shouldn't have to work too hard. Or you definitely can't risk doing things you're not good at immediately. Nah, get over yourself. Let me repeat. If you want to reinvent your career or change careers or start a business, then you are going to have to do things that you've never done before. Take action or do things that will feel uncomfortable and that are impossible to get right or perfect straight away. And that might, gasp, result in what you perceive as failure. So if you insist on perfectionism, and you're being a perfectionist, a toxic kind of perfectionism when it comes to your career transition, then what's going to happen is you're going to see every single new uncomfortable thing to do with your career transition, to do with that business as an opportunity for you to fail. You're not going to enjoy it. You're going to give up early because you're not perfect. You don't get it perfect straight away. So therefore, and I see this happening all the time, you either don't really try very hard, or you give up really early, or you don't even try. And you definitely don't allow yourself to go all in. You sort of half-ass it. Or you try and then you realize you're no good and then you avoid and you stop early, i.e., you never get to the practice stage. Just think back to the last 6 months, 12 months, 5 years, however long you wanted to make a change. What were the things that you just didn't do because you're like, oh, you had those kind of toxic perfectionist claws in you? Maybe you didn't put on that workshop. Maybe you didn't attend that course. Maybe you didn't reach out to that person. What is it that you didn't allow yourself to do again and again? And also, by the way, this is not just to do with work. You will see this in several other areas in your life where, if you can't get it perfect straight away, or you had a stab and you weren't good at it initially, or you were afraid of failure, you just stopped doing it. It never became a practice. Am I inside of your head right now? I cannot tell you how important this realization is, because that's how you depersonalize it. My friend, this is not about you as a person or your worth as a person. This is about a real toxic tendency, a buffer that you put yourself between you and your dreams. Right? So just realize that what's happening, all of those things you are procrastinating on or delaying or being afraid of, it's because you are seeing them as being opportunities for failure, to be a failure. Let's talk about how to view them instead. Let's talk about how to change that toxic attitude, and let's talk about how to get into action, how to get into practice. Here's my challenge to you. And this is how I challenge all of my perfectionist clients. What if you turned all of this around, and instead of viewing all of those things, all of those activities and skills and things you know you need to do, what if instead of viewing them as opportunities to fail, what if you viewed them as opportunities to learn and to grow? So rather being opportunities to fail, they're opportunities to learn and grow. Those very opportunities and those very challenges that you actually do need to grow through in order to come out on the other side as a career changer and as an entrepreneur. We grow into things. We don't just naturally, fully fledged and perfect step into things. This is why I joke that, if you want to, get to know yourself really quickly, just try changing careers or start, the career transition process. This is really so important. One of the biggest gifts and mindset shifts you can give yourself, and one of the best ways to start replacing a perfectionist mindset and the behavior is to replace it with a growth and learning mindset. Let me know if you want to go deeper with this in a coming podcast. It's so important. You want to decide that finishing your transition is more important than perfectly never even starting it. All right? This, my friend, is likely where you're stuck right now. It's so hard for you to allow yourself to engage and go fully in on all of the very activities and skills that you actually need to grow into learning how to do imperfectly initially, and then you will get there over time. That's right now, you are not a career changer. You are not the kind of person who does that kind of business. You need to grow into becoming that person, and you only learn to do that by doing new, imperfect, scary things. That's why you're stuck, because you're not allowing yourself to engage with the change process. The change process will only happen positively when you start allowing yourself to engage with learning and with growing. Okay? Now, I wish that I could tell you that I'm perfect, that I didn't have this issue of toxic perfectionism when I started my own company, but I did. And I still have tons of traces that I need to work with. And also a lot of my clients over the years, they've been those kind of toxic perfectionists too. So let's talk about how to change it. Because here's the deal, I want this so badly for you too. When I look back over my work life, pretty much any kind of regret that I have or delay that I can spot, it all came down to my bloody perfectionism. I used to be a total perfectionist too, of the toxic type, back when I was stuck in a corporate job that I really didn't want to be in anymore, that corporate career. So I used to work in human resources, so HR for American investment banks here in London, Morgan Stanley, Citigroup Asset Management, and I was really caught up in my professional identity being perfect. I was known for producing top quality work, having really high standards, being a solid pair of hands. Have you ever been called a solid pair of hands? Perfectionists tend to be called that. super high work ethics, super exhausting long hours. I knew, and I was known for being very good at what I was doing and doing things well. I was in that dangerous zone of good, right? I was very comfortably perfectionist. But when I decided to, and by the way, can you relate? That might be where you are right now. It's that safe bit. You're really good at what you're doing, even if you hate it. But back then, when I decided to leave that corporate career behind to start my career change consultancy, it's back in 2005, I quickly realized that I had to start doing quite a few new things and learn quite a few new skills if I wanted to break out on my own and start my own company. Activities and things I'd never done before, and where there was no way that I could do them perfectly and, or be good at them initially or naturally good at them initially. So I had that choice. I could clearly see that it might not work out. That was also really scary. That new business might not work out. Whereas my HR career, now that was a solid, perfect bet. I bet you're there right now as well. And that's when you realize that it's not enough to just know what you don't like or what you want to escape from. It's just as important to know why you're doing it and what you are actually looking to get out of making that transition. And to most importantly, decide what matters most to you. What matters most to you in the bigger scheme of things? Because perfectionists are terribly myopic. I had to decide, and you have to decide. I had to decide what mattered most to me. You have to decide what matters most to you. I had to get clear on and decide what mattered more to me than perfection, what mattered more to me than being perfect at my job, even if that was really scary to that perfect corporate identity that I'd built up, who I thought I was back then. And I focused so much on what I stood to lose. And I bet you might be the same. A lot of people focus so much more on what they stand to lose by taking imperfect action and by going for something that might result in failure than they do on what they stand to gain. So here's the decision I made, and feel free to borrow. The decision I made was that it was much more important to me to create a work life, to create a career and a business that I truly loved, that made me feel fully alive, that I was fully engaged with, that engaged me both socially, creatively, and intellectually, and also to do my own thing. That was so much more important for me than it was to be perfect and to stay stuck in a career that I had totally outgrown. It was more important for me to discover who else I was, what else I could relate, what else I could create, to be open to learn and to finish that transition. That was more important to me than it was to stay stuck in a quotation mark perfect work scenario. I bet you're there right now, and that is a decision you need to make too. So what was the upshot of that decision? What were the behaviors, the mindset that I needed to leave behind, and also that I've since helped hundreds of clients make? I realized that I needed to stop using my perfectionism as a buffer against my dreams, a buffer that both protected me from failure and delayed my dreams. I needed to stop doing everything possible to avoid failure, to protect myself from failure, and to be okay, even if it was difficult, to be a newbie at certain things. Yes, this is hard. Same thing for you, my friend. You have got to let your perfect guard down. You've got to look at all of the things that you are not allowing yourself to do or to fully engage with or go all in on, right? That is so, so important, and to get help, all right? Allow yourself to be a newbie. And also know that that's one of the most important future-proofing skills you can ever develop. Perfectionism isn't. Now, I had a choice, right? To stop being just someone who was like observing and watching and being a peeper, and instead being an action taker. I had a choice, and you do too. I could remain this perfectionistic, overthinking person, really stuck in the quotation mark perfect career I wanted to leave behind. Or I could decide to become a brave doer who took imperfect action. Because here's the deal. I was still good enough. And even if I failed, I wasn't the failure. I was still good enough, right? Nothing changes about you, just about what you do. I could be okay with sucking, with being wobbly for a period of time, whilst I was on this learning and growth curve. And here's the thing, my friend, if you know anything about psychology, you know that growth is where all of the good stuff lies. The good stuff does not lie where you might be right now, which is stuck in that perfect professional comfort zone. Especially, like I say, there is no future-proofing in staying stuck in a perfect scenario you hate where you don't allow yourself to grow. So I chose to act like a brave doer and to take action. And I actually surprised myself by how well I handled it and also who I could also be. And I got insanely curious about who I also was. And you know what? I am so glad that I gave myself permission to suck on the way to creating my dream business, because since 2005, I've personally helped hundreds of private clients and reached thousands more, just like you. I help them change careers, reinvent careers, or start their own business. And that's been so much more rewarding and amazing than staying stuck and perfect in my old career could ever have given me. You know, if I hadn't made the choice to suck on the way to starting this business, you wouldn't be listening to me right now. I wouldn't have helped all those hundreds of people. And what a loss for both of us, right? I allowed myself to be wobbly and imperfect for long enough to build something that mattered more. Let me know, by the way, if this is helpful, if you're finding this podcast helpful. This podcast would not have existed if I didn't allow myself to be imperfect. By the way, every time I record it, as a recovering perfectionist, I still go through that same struggle. So by the way, let me know if you're enjoying the podcast. You know, on Apple iTunes, Apple Podcast, iTunes, please write a review if you like this podcast. Let me know if it's worth it. Let me know if you like it, if it's helpful. And also, of course, come over to thecareerchangepodcast.com. Make sure you're on the newsletter so you can also ask questions. But I only made this transition because I chose to stop insisting on perfection and stopped behaving like a perfectionist. And instead, I started doing things that felt really wobbly and that might, gasp, result in failure. And you need to make that decision and that commitment too if you want to move on. Because if not, your perfectionism is not going to allow you to make that transition. And only you can make that decision and only you can make that commitment. And this is actually one of the hardest things to observe as a career transition advisor. You know, I've been a career transition advisor entrepreneur for 15 years now, and I see so many people, they have everything lined up for them to take action on, but then they don't because, you know, it's never the perfect time. There's a recession, there's a certain precedent, there's a certain epidemic, whatever it is, you know, or they have this idea that their idea for their business or their career change is not perfect enough, or their product is not perfect enough, or the time is not perfect enough, or they're not qualified enough, or they're not good enough. La-di-da, what is your excuse right now? What's your perfectionism excuse right now why you cannot start making that change, even if it's just initially on the side, right? That deeper excuse. Let's dig deeper. What's this excuses about not enough or not perfect enough really down to? What are you really trying to protect yourself from? What are you really trying to delay? Failure. Let's pull it all together here, right? Perfectionism, toxic perfectionism equals fear of failure. So perfectionism is the perfect buffer, both as a protection mechanism and as a delay mechanism, but not as a mechanism for doing your best work in the world and for discovering who you really are. So back to overriding it. You, my friend, need to decide what matters most. What's most important to you at this stage of your life? Is it most important for you to be perfect? What's helpful for me is to have this kind of image in my head of this kind of really perfect looking person, you know, butt cheeks clenched, you know, keeping the status quo, being really perfect, or someone who actually looks genuinely happy and fulfilled because it's more important for them to make their dreams come true. Which one do you want to choose, right? Sorry to break it to you. I've never seen a perfectionist being able to be both perfect and change careers. It's just not possible. So choose to be that more interesting person who allow themselves to suck for a little while. Give yourself permission to suck a little. Because here's what I really want you to remember. Failure is never final. Yes, you might have to do things that feel uncomfortable or you might feel really scared, but you're not going to die. Failure is never final. Final is staying stuck in a job or career or business you hate, that you totally outgrown, but you're still there because you insist on things being perfect. That's, my friend, is what you should worry about rather than failure on the way to your dreams. Right? The real failure is staying stuck in a job or career scenario, a business that you hate. That's the real failure, right? That's the real cost Just remember that. That should make you get your butt in gear. I know it's, and instead get a lot more curious about what you are capable of doing. I know it's hard to hear all of this when you're a perfectionist who's just trying to hold your perfect world together. But I'm here because I know that for you, like I've seen with myself and all of my clients, is that it's possible to create something much better, much more interesting, much more exciting, and also over time, more perfect, right? So the way to change away from perfectionism is to decide what matters most to you and to act accordingly, to stop letting perfectionism decide who you are and what you're capable of. Curiosity over perfection, my friend. Interesting over perfection. And to decide that, what matters most to you is just to see how far you could get, right? Yes, you're going to be drawn by perfectionism. You're going to be doing everything possible to avoid or protect yourself from failure. But instead, what that means if you continue on that road is, and I see this, perfectionists often end up at the end of their lives being very resentful, very regretful, and really boring as well, actually, because they never allow themselves to experience what they're truly capable of creating, becoming, of being. Whereas people who decide that, okay, I know I have these perfectionist tendency, but I'm still going to go ahead and act bravely and take imperfect actions, they're the ones who make their dreams come true. And they're the ones who have the most interesting lives. I would love for you to join me to become one of those too, all right? So here's what you want to do next. Come over to thecareerchangepodcast.com. Make sure you're on the newsletter. You get a lot more like this. And that's also where you can ask questions for the podcast, all right? And like I said, if you are liking this podcast, make sure you write a review over on Apple Podcast or on iTunes. Let me know if you like this, what you want to hear more of, okay? And make sure you share it with a fellow perfectionist. And that's over at thecareerchangepodcast.com. And for the reviews, make sure you go over to Apple Podcast and iTunes. Here's the really interesting thing. There has never been a better, more convenient time to stop being a perfectionist. Nobody is expecting perfection from you in this new world of work. Use that to your advantage, my friend. I'm sending you a big virtual hug, and I'll see you over at thecareerchangepodcast.com. Thank you for listening.